You checked the number again at 2 a.m. Then you closed the banking app, opened it, closed it. The number hadn't changed. It never changes just because you looked at it twice. This isn't about money, not really. It's about the version of you that did everything you were told to do, worked the extra hour, took the certification, said yes to the project nobody wanted, and still, somehow, you are standing in the same room you started in, except more tired and quieter about it now. You stopped telling people your plans a while back. You noticed how that felt like giving up something you never got to name. What you're about to hear is not a productivity system, and it is not a mindset trick. It's the uncomfortable possibility that the effort was never the missing ingredient, and that something underneath the effort has been running the entire time, deciding in advance what you were allowed to receive. Here is the part that will bother you until it doesn't. You have been trying to fix your circumstances, but your circumstances were never the author of your life. They were only ever the transcript. Based on the book Creative Mind and Success by Ernest Holmes, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The First Crack. The morning the numbers stopped adding up. You get the email at 6:47 a.m. before your alarm because you'd already been awake for 20 minutes, pretending you weren't. Congratulations. The promotion came through. You read it twice, waiting for the feeling to arrive, and it doesn't arrive. And you sit there in the blue light of the phone screen wondering if something is wrong with you for not feeling anything at all. This is the first crack. Not the failure, the success that doesn't land. You have spent years assuming that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is a gap of effort. Work harder, and the gap closes. Learn more, and the gap closes. Say yes more often. Position yourself better. Network with more intention, and the gap closes. You have done all of it. You are doing it right now, reading this. Looking for the next input to add to the machine, and the promotion in your inbox is proof that the machine works. It produces exactly what you feed it. So why does it feel like nothing? Here is the sentence you have never let yourself finish. I got what I wanted, and it didn't change the thing that was actually broken. You tell yourself it's just exhaustion. You tell yourself the feeling will catch up once the paperwork is signed, once the new title is on the door, once you've had a weekend to rest. You have said some version of this to yourself for years, at every threshold that was supposed to be the one that mattered. The graduation, the first real job, the apartment with your name alone on the lease. Each time you crossed the threshold and looked around for the different person you were supposed to become on the other side of it. And each time you found the same person, holding the same low hum of dissatisfaction, now dressed slightly better. This is not a story about ingratitude. You know how good you have it, and that knowledge doesn't help, because gratitude was never the missing variable either. You can be fully aware of your privilege and still feel underneath it, like you are running a program that was installed before you had any say in the matter, and that the program was never actually optimized for the outcome you keep chasing. Somewhere, without ever deciding to, you adopted a working theory of how success operates. Input effort, receive result. It's the theory taught in school, reinforced by every performance review, confirmed by every certificate on the wall. And it isn't wrong exactly. It's incomplete in a way that costs you more the longer you rely on it, because it only accounts for the visible layer of how a result gets produced. It says nothing about the layer underneath, the assumptions you carry into the effort, the private verdict you've already reached about what you're allowed to have, the quiet ceiling you built years ago and now mistake for the sky. Consider the difference between a person who works from scarcity and a person who works from conviction. Both might put in the same hours. Both might produce from the outside the same result. But scarcity works like a hand gripping something too tightly, afraid it will slip. Conviction works like a hand that is already let go, because it knows the thing was never going anywhere. You can watch two people do the identical job and feel, without being able to say why, that one of them is going to break eventually, and the other one isn't. That difference is not visible on a resume. It lives somewhere earlier than behavior. It lives in what each of them privately believes is true about their own capacity to receive. You have been operating from the first hand for longer than you've noticed. Gripping, bracing, treating every win as temporary and every stretch of ease as the quiet before something takes it back. And the exhausting part isn't the grip itself. It's that gripping this hard for this long actually works, up to a point. It gets you the promotion. It gets you the email at 6:47 in the morning. And then it stops. Not because you stopped trying, but because gripping was never designed to get you past a certain threshold. Past that point, something else has to take over. And nobody told you there was a something else, so you just gripped harder and wondered why harder wasn't working anymore. There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from doing everything right and still not trusting the outcome. You know this tired. You felt it this morning, reading an email that should have felt like a rival, and instead felt like one more data point in a pattern you haven't been able to name. You're about to be given the language for it. Not a hack, not a 5-step framework you'll forget by Thursday. Something closer to a diagnosis, the kind that's uncomfortable at first because it means the problem was never external, and then becomes the only thing that has ever actually made sense of your own history. Somewhere between the effort you keep applying and the results you keep half receiving, there is a mechanism running that you have never once looked at directly. It has been shaping every outcome in your life since before you had the vocabulary to notice it working. And the first step isn't fixing it. The first step is simply admitting it's there, sitting in the dark next to your bed at 6:47 in the morning, quietly deciding before you've even opened your eyes what you're going to be allowed to feel about the good news. There's a difference worth naming here, because it will keep resurfacing throughout everything that follows. Achievement and arrival are not the same event, though you have been treating them as though they must arrive together. Achievement is a fact, verifiable, external, stamped with a date and a title. Arrival is a feeling, internal, and it answers to a completely different authority than the one that grants achievements. You can accumulate an entire lifetime of the former and still be waiting indefinitely for the latter, because nothing about crossing an external threshold automatically revises whatever your system has quietly decided about what you're allowed to feel once you're standing on the other side of it. Consider the long-term consequence of this gap if it goes unexamined, because it doesn't stay contained to a single email at 6:47 in the morning. Left alone, this pattern compounds. Each unfelt arrival teaches your system, a little more firmly, that the goalposts were never really the problem, and that the next one, further out, larger, more impressive, might finally be the one that produces the feeling the previous ones didn't. This is how an entire life gets spent in pursuit of a horizon that recedes exactly as fast as you approach it, not because the horizon is cruel, but because the actual location of the feeling was never out there to begin with. Ask yourself honestly, how many thresholds you've already crossed, carrying this exact confusion, mistaking the achievement for the arrival, and how many more you're prepared to cross before you consider that the strategy itself might be the thing worth questioning, rather than the specific goal you happen to be chasing at the time. This isn't a rhetorical flourish. It's the actual hinge the rest of this book turns on. Everything that follows assumes you're willing to stop adding new goals to an unexamined machine and start examining the machine itself, however uncomfortable that examination turns out to be in the chapters ahead. You close the email, you still haven't smiled. Chapter 2. The Lie You Tell Efficiently. Why you keep missing what's already in front of you. There's a version of this morning that repeats itself in different clothes. A friend points out gently that you've mentioned the same complaint for the 3rd time this month, and you laugh it off and change the subject. and drive home wondering why the observation stuck to you like a burr. You didn't argue with it, you just moved past it, fast. The way you move past a pothole you've hit so many times, you no longer bother slowing down for it. This is not forgetting. Forgetting is passive. What you're doing is active, and it's fast. And it's so practiced you no longer experience it as a decision at all. Call it what it is. You are choosing in real time not to see the thing that would require you to change. Not because you're weak, because it's efficient. Seeing it means acting on it. And acting on it means dismantling a structure you built specifically so you wouldn't have to think about this every single day. The not seeing isn't a failure of awareness. It's a system working exactly as designed, and the design brief was survival, not truth. Here's the distinction that matters, and it's one you've never been handed cleanly. There is a difference between not knowing and refusing to know. Not knowing is innocent. It has no weight, no cost, because there was nothing to carry. Refusing to know is different. It requires energy. It requires a small, constant maintenance effort. The same way holding a door shut against wind takes more out of you than simply not being near the door at all. You have been standing against that door for years, and you've gotten so good at it that you've stopped noticing your arms are tired. Think about the last time someone told you something true about yourself that you didn't want to hear. Not cruel, true. Maybe it was about how you handle conflict by disappearing instead of engaging. Maybe it was about how your ambition has a shape that looks like control. Whatever it was, notice what happened in your body in the 3 seconds after you heard it. There was a flinch, a tiny internal scramble, and then almost instantly, a story arrived to make the flinch stop. They don't really know me, they're projecting. That's not fair considering everything I've been through. The story wasn't a lie exactly. It was a reflex, faster than reasoning, built for one purpose. Close the gap between what you just heard and what you can bear to hold. This reflex has a name in the oldest traditions of thought about the mind, though it rarely gets discussed as bluntly as it deserves. It isn't denial in the cartoon sense, the person insisting the house isn't on fire while flames lick the windows. It's subtler and far more sustainable than that. It's selective attention with a mission. Your mind isn't refusing to see reality. It's curating which parts of reality you're permitted to focus on, based on a decision made long before this particular morning, about which truths are safe to hold and which ones threaten the structure you currently call your life. You didn't choose this consciously. Nobody sits down at 7 years old and decides, I will now build an elaborate system for avoiding the parts of myself that are inconvenient. It happens the way scar tissue happens. Something hurt once. The hurting stopped being useful information and became instead a threat to root around. And your mind, remarkably efficient, built the detour so well that you now mistake the detour for the road. Here's the part that will unsettle you more than the diagnosis itself. The system isn't broken, it's working. Right now, as you read this, some part of you is already doing the thing it does, quietly deciding which sentence in this chapter you'll let land and which one you'll skim past, nodding, moving on. You will not catch it happening in real time. That's the nature of a well-built mechanism. It doesn't announce itself. It only shows up later, as the vague sense that you read something important and somehow retained none of it. This is why effort alone has never been enough for you, and why it never will be. You can work 60 hours a week and still be avoiding the 1 hour of honest self-examination that would change the trajectory of the other 59. Effort is visible. It photographs well. It gets recognized in a performance review. The refusal to look, on the other hand, is invisible even to you, which is precisely what makes it so durable. You cannot fix what you have trained yourself not to see, and you have trained yourself expertly. There's a question worth sitting with uncomfortably before you move to the next page. Not what am I avoiding, because that question is already contaminated by the same reflex you're trying to examine. It will hand you an answer that's true enough to feel honest and safe enough not to cost you anything. The better question is this: what have I gotten unusually good at changing the subject away from? Not the subject itself, the pattern of turning away. Notice how quickly, even now, your mind is already offering you an exit from this question, a smaller and more manageable version of it to answer instead. You have built an entire architecture around not looking directly at one particular room in the house. You walk past its door every day. You've gotten so skilled at walking past it that you no longer register the door as a door. It has become part of the wall. There's an honest question worth answering before you move on, because it's likely already forming somewhere in the back of your mind. If the not seeing is this efficient, this well-built, why does it sometimes fail? Why do certain moments, a stranger's offhand comment, a late-night conversation, a piece of writing that seems to speak directly to you, occasionally slip past the entire architecture and land anyway? The answer matters more than it first appears to. The system isn't designed to be impenetrable. It's designed to be efficient, which means it economizes its effort, defending the areas you visit most often and leaving the unfamiliar entrances, the angles you rarely approach from, comparatively unguarded. A truth delivered in a form you don't recognize as a threat, second-hand, indirect, wrapped in someone else's story instead of pointed at you directly, can walk straight through a door built to stop the version of that truth you were expecting. This is worth distinguishing from something that looks similar but isn't. Denial as a permanent condition versus denial as a temporary situational maintenance cost. You are not permanently incapable of seeing the thing you've been avoiding. You are currently paying an ongoing cost to keep it out of view, and ongoing costs, unlike permanent conditions, can eventually become more expensive than the alternative. This is often exactly what precedes real change in a person's life. Not a sudden burst of courage arriving from nowhere, but the maintenance cost of not seeing finally exceeding what the seeing would have cost in the first place. You are, in this exact moment, closer to that threshold than you were a year ago, or you wouldn't still be here, reading a chapter specifically designed to name what you've spent years arranging not to look at. The next chapter is going to name what's inside that room, not gently. You've had gentle for years, and gentle has been part of how the door stayed closed. Chapter 3. The Ceiling with No Address. Giving language to what you've always felt but never described. You felt it in specific rooms. The interview where you undersold yourself without meaning to, using a smaller number than the one you'd practiced in the mirror. The negotiation where you accepted the first offer, telling yourself it was fine, telling yourself you didn't want to seem greedy. The relationship where you settled quietly for less warmth than you needed, because asking for more felt like tempting fate. Different rooms, different stakes, and yet the same invisible hand pulling you back to a smaller version of what you actually wanted. There's a name for this pattern once you stop treating each instance as separate. It isn't bad luck showing up repeatedly in unrelated situations. It's one thing wearing different outfits. Call it the ceiling, though that word makes it sound architectural, external, something you could point to on a blueprint. It isn't external. You built it. And you built it so early, and so many times reinforced it without knowing you were doing construction work, that by now it functions less like a decision and more like gravity. Here is what the ceiling actually is, stated plainly for the first time. It is a private, unspoken agreement you made with yourself about how much good you are allowed to receive before something in you starts working, quietly and diligently, to bring things back down to the level you consider normal. Not the level you consciously want. The level you have decided, somewhere beneath conscious reach, that matches who you believe yourself to be. This is why raises don't stick the way you expect them to. This is why the good relationship starts to feel unfamiliar, almost itchy, in a way the difficult ones never did. Difficulty is familiar. Difficulty confirms the old math. Ease is the anomaly, and your system, built for consistency rather than happiness, treats anomalies as errors to be corrected. Sit with that for a second. Because it reframes everything you've assumed about self-sabotage. You have probably called yourself self-destructive at some point, as though there were a small saboteur inside you working against your own interests out of malice or stupidity. That framing is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that has kept you stuck because you cannot fix a system you've mischaracterized. There is no saboteur. There is only a very consistent, very loyal mechanism doing exactly what it was built to do. Protect the version of reality you privately believe is true about yourself, even when that version costs you the life you say you want. Loyalty is the word that will bother you the most in that last sentence. And it should. Because loyalty implies allegiance to something, and the something your mind is loyal to is not your stated ambition. It's your established identity. Your ambition is new, recently adopted, still under construction. Your identity is old, load-bearing, decided long before you had any say in it. When the two conflict, identity wins almost every time, and it wins so quietly you mistake the loss for a coincidence. Think about a person raised to believe that money causes conflict, that it makes people cold or corrupts relationships. That belief was probably formed watching two people they loved argue about bills at a kitchen table decades ago. The belief was never examined again. It simply sat there, absorbed and forgotten, doing its work in the background. Now that person earns well, and something strange happens every time the number climbs past a certain point. An unexpected expense appears. A generous impulse drains the account. A bad investment, made in a moment of uncharacteristic carelessness, brings the balance back down to the range that feels, without any conscious thought at all, like home. You could call this bad luck 50 different times across 50 different years and never once connect the dots, because each individual event has a perfectly reasonable explanation. The car really did need new brakes. The investment really did seem sound at the time. Nothing about any single instance looks engineered. It's only when you step back far enough to see the pattern across years that the coincidence stops being believable, and something closer to design starts to emerge from the noise. This is the part where you'll want to ask what caused it, and that question, tempting as it is, will have to wait. Naming the origin too early gives you a place to put the blame, and blame is just another exit, another well-practiced way of turning away from the room instead of walking into it. Right now, all that matters is this. The ceiling is real, it is yours, and it has been running your life with more consistency than your conscious intentions ever have. Here is the distinction that separates people who eventually break through this from people who spend a lifetime bumping against the same invisible height. It is the difference between wanting more and believing you are the kind of person more happens to. Wanting is cheap. Wanting costs nothing and changes nothing, because wanting operates entirely at the level of desire, and desire has never been the layer where your ceiling lives. Belief is expensive. Belief requires you to actually revise the private, unexamined verdict you reached about yourself years ago, usually before you were old enough to know a verdict was being reached at all. You have wanted more for years. You have made vision boards, set goals, read the books, taken the courses. And still, at some threshold that feels suspiciously consistent across every domain of your life, something pulls you back. Not because the goal was wrong, because the goal exceeded what you have quietly agreed you're allowed to keep. This is the moment where most people close the book, uncomfortable, and go back to optimizing the visible layer, the effort, the strategy, the hustle, because that layer is at least within their control. You are not most people, or you wouldn't still be listening. There's a distinction worth drawing here between a ceiling and a limit because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion itself does damage. A limit is a fact about the world, a genuine constraint imposed by circumstance, resources, or physical reality. A ceiling is a fact about a decision, made once, rarely revisited, and mistaken for a limit ever since. The tragedy isn't that ceilings exist. It's that they get filed in the same mental category as limits, treated with the same finality, when the two require completely different responses. You don't argue with a limit. You work around it, or you accept it. A ceiling, on the other hand, only survives because it has never been correctly identified as a decision rather than a fact. Consider the long-term consequence of leaving a ceiling misfiled as a limit for another decade. It isn't neutral. Every year the confusion persists. The ceiling gets a little more evidence to point to. Because a life lived beneath a ceiling produces exactly the kind of modest, contained results that make the ceiling look like an accurate description of your actual capacity. This is the quiet cruelty of the mechanism. It doesn't just impose a boundary. It manufactures the proof that the boundary was reasonable all along. And the proof accumulates precisely because you stopped testing it years ago. The ceiling has a shape. It has a history. And for the first time, you're about to look at both directly, instead of walking past the door pretending it's part of the wall. Chapter 4. The Anatomy Beneath the Habit. How the mechanism actually operates without blame. Here is what nobody explained to you clearly enough, early enough, for it to matter. Your mind does not respond to what is true. It responds to what it has accepted as true. These are not the same thing. And the gap between them is where your entire adult life has been quietly negotiated. You can know intellectually that you deserve rest. You can say the words out loud, mean them, even write them in a journal you keep specifically for this purpose. And still, the moment an actual afternoon of unscheduled rest arrives, something in you starts generating tasks. The laundry that wasn't urgent yesterday becomes urgent. The email that could wait until Monday suddenly can't. This isn't hypocrisy. It's evidence that the layer where real change happens sits beneath the layer where you form opinions about yourself. Picture the mind as operating on two distinct levels, and notice that most of the advice you've ever received addresses only one of them. The first level is conscious thought, the sentences you can hear yourself thinking, the goals you write down, the affirmations you repeat in the mirror. This level is loud, articulate, and almost entirely powerless on its own. The second level is the accepted premise, the belief your system treats as settled fact, no longer up for debate. This level is silent. It doesn't announce itself in sentences. It shows up only in outcomes, in the recurring pattern you've spent 3 chapters learning to recognize. The relationship between these two levels explains something that has probably confused you for years. Why positive thinking, on its own, so often fails to produce positive results. You can say the affirmation with total sincerity, and nothing changes. And you conclude that affirmations don't work, when what actually happened is more precise than that. You addressed the loud level and left the silent level completely untouched. It's the difference between repainting a room and repairing the foundation beneath it. The paint looks fine for a while. The crack was never in the paint. Consider what accepted premise actually means, because the phrase is doing more work than it first appears to. An accepted premise isn't something you agree with in the way you agree with a fact you read in a newspaper. It's something you no longer question at all, the way you no longer question that the floor will hold you when you stand on it. You don't decide, each morning, to believe in gravity. You simply operate as though it's true, without deliberation, because deliberation stopped being necessary a long time ago. Your deepest beliefs about your own worth function exactly the same way. You don't decide each day that you're only allowed a certain amount of ease. You simply operate from that premise invisibly, the same way you operate from gravity. This is why the mechanism feels so resistant to willpower. Willpower lives at the loud level. It's a conscious, effortful push against a current. The premise lives at the silent level, upstream of effort entirely, shaping the current itself. You can push against a current with everything you have, and the current will still be there tomorrow, indifferent to your exhaustion, because pushing was never going to change its source. Here's where the anatomy gets specific enough to be useful. The accepted premise doesn't operate through some mystical force acting on the external world. It operates through something far more mundane and far more within reach: attention, interpretation, and behavior. All three shaped continuously by what you've settled at the silent level as true. If you have accepted, somewhere below conscious reach, that people eventually leave, your attention will register departure cues that someone else in the exact same relationship wouldn't notice. Your interpretation will read a canceled dinner as the beginning of the end rather than a scheduling conflict. And your behavior, quietly, protectively, will begin creating distance before the other person gets the chance to. Three separate mechanisms, one shared root, and from the outside it looks exactly like fate confirming what you always knew was coming. It was never fate. It was infrastructure. This is not a story about victimhood, and it would be a mistake to read it that way. You are not a passive recipient of a program installed by forces beyond your control, doomed to watch it run. The premise was built, which means it can be rebuilt. But rebuilding requires something most people skip entirely, because it's less satisfying than a new habit tracker or a fresh set of goals. It requires locating the actual premise, specifically, in your own words, rather than treating the outcome as the problem to be solved. Try this honestly before moving forward. Take one area where the pattern keeps repeating. Not the vague area, the specific one. Finish this sentence without editing it for how it sounds. Somewhere in me, I have accepted that. Let the ugliest, most unflattering version of the sentence arrive first, because that version is usually closer to the truth than the version you'd say out loud at a dinner party. Maybe it's, I have accepted that good things are temporary. Maybe it's, I have accepted that I have to earn rest through suffering first. Whatever surfaces, don't argue with it yet. Just look at it. The way you'd look at an X-ray, without expecting the X-ray to feel good. This is the anatomy, not a character flaw, not evidence of weakness, a structure, built for reasons that once made sense, now operating on autopilot long after the original reasons stopped applying. Structures can be examined. Structures can be changed. But only once you've stopped mistaking them for the truth about who you are, and started seeing them for what they actually are, a premise you accepted once, and never got around to questioning again. There's a distinction that will help you hold this without collapsing into self-criticism. The difference between a premise and a fact masquerading as one. A fact can be checked against reality directly, repeatedly, by anyone. A premise wearing the costume of a fact resists exactly this kind of checking, not because it's true, but because you've stopped attempting the check. You haven't tested whether you're allowed to rest in years. You've simply operated as though the question was already settled, and unsettled questions that go untested for long enough start to feel indistinguishable from settled ones. Here's the honest question worth sitting with before the next chapter, because it will do more for you than any technique. If this premise were installed by someone else, a stranger, describing your worth, your capacity, your right to ease, in the exact terms you privately hold, would you accept their authority to make that determination? Most people, asked this directly, answer immediately and without hesitation. Of course not. And yet the determination has been running your life for years, unexamined, simply because it arrived from inside rather than outside, as though the source of a belief were somehow proof of its accuracy. It isn't. A belief installed by a frightened 7-year-old carries exactly as much authority as you choose today to keep giving it. Nothing more. Notice, too, that the two levels described here are not equally visible to the people around you, which is part of why this work can feel so isolating in its early stages. Others see your loud level, your stated goals, your visible effort, and judge your progress by it, sometimes generously, sometimes not. None of them can see the silent level directly, the actual premise doing the deciding underneath. This means you may look, from the outside, exactly like someone who is succeeding, while privately experiencing the specific, quiet exhaustion of a foundation that hasn't moved at all. Understanding this gap protects you from a particular kind of loneliness, The sense that something is wrong with you specifically because no one else seems to notice what you're carrying. They can't. It was never visible to them. It's barely been visible to you. Chapter 5. The Bill You Never Saw Itemized. The real price, calculated honestly, without theatrics. There's a version of you that exists in a parallel column, the one you don't like to look at because looking at it means admitting the invoice has been running the entire time. Not a version with a different job or a different partner necessarily. A version who simply didn't flinch at the threshold where you flinched, who took the raise without negotiating it down in her own head first, who stayed in the room during the argument instead of leaving it 3 sentences before it got honest. That version isn't fictional. She's the compound interest on every moment you chose the smaller option because the smaller option felt safer. You have never itemized this bill, and there's a reason for that beyond simple avoidance. The cost of the ceiling doesn't arrive as a single dramatic loss you can point to and grieve properly. It arrives as 1,000 small subtractions, each one too minor on its own to justify the grief. And grief needs a target large enough to earn its own attention. So instead of grieving once clearly, you carry a low-grade, constant awareness that something has been quietly leaking out of your life for years, and you've never had the vocabulary to name what. Start with the money, because it's the most countable version of the cost, even though it's far from the most important one. Every time you have undersold yourself, in a negotiation, a rate, an invoice you were embarrassed to send at the number you actually needed, you were not simply making a financial choice. You were casting a vote for the premise. Each vote reinforced the belief that the smaller number was the appropriate one, the safe one, the one that wouldn't invite scrutiny or envy or the vague threat of being seen as too much. Multiply that vote by every year you've been working, and you arrive at a number that would genuinely disturb you if you sat down and calculated it honestly. Most people never do the math. The vagueness is more comfortable than the total. But the money is the least of it, and if you stop here, you'll miss the more expensive column entirely. Consider what the ceiling has cost you in terms of the relationships you didn't pursue because they seemed like more than you were built to hold. The friendship you let fade rather than risk the vulnerability of asking someone to stay close during a hard season. The romantic possibility you talked yourself out of because the person seemed on paper like too much good fortune for someone like you, and something in you distrusts good fortune the way other people distrust strangers. You called this being realistic. It was never realism. It was the premise, negotiating on your behalf, in a language you'd trained yourself not to recognize as its own. There's a subtler cost still, harder to see because it doesn't show up as an absence of anything. It shows up as the presence of something. The low, constant hum of vigilance you've carried for years. The part of you that never fully exhales even during good stretches. Because good stretches have always felt, to your nervous system, like the setup for the next correction. This vigilance has a physical cost you've probably never connected to its actual source. The shoulders that won't drop, the sleep that never quite goes deep enough. You've likely blamed stress, work, circumstance, all of it plausible, all of it partially true, and all of it missing the deeper current running underneath. A body that has never been given permission to believe good things are allowed to simply continue. Here is the distinction worth sitting with, because it changes how you'll read the rest of this book. There's a difference between a cost you chose and a cost you paid without ever being told the bill existed. A chosen cost carries dignity. You decided consciously this trade was worth it, and you can live with a chosen cost because you authored it. The cost you've been paying isn't like that. You never saw the bill. Nobody handed it to you and asked whether the trade was acceptable. It was deducted automatically, month after month, year after year, from an account you didn't know was open. This is not a chapter designed to make you feel foolish for not noticing sooner. Noticing sooner was never realistically available to you, because the entire structure was built to be invisible. And invisibility isn't a flaw in the design. It's the design working exactly as intended. You cannot resent yourself for missing a bill that was engineered specifically not to be seen. But you can stop paying it starting now, and that requires something specific. Converting the vague sense of loss into a precise accounting, not to punish yourself with the total. To finally see it clearly enough that the premise loses some of its power simply by being named in daylight. Things that operate in the dark tend to lose a portion of their grip the moment you turn the light directly on them, not because the light destroys them instantly, but because darkness was part of how they worked. Take a moment honestly, and name one specific thing the ceiling has cost you. Not the vague category, the specific instance, the conversation you didn't have, the number you didn't ask for, the person you let walk away because staying seemed like more happiness than you were built to hold. Let yourself feel the actual weight of that one thing, fully, without immediately reaching for the silver lining or the lesson learned. You are allowed to grieve a cost before you're ready to fix it. There's a distinction worth making here between grief and regret, because the two feel similar and lead in opposite directions. Regret keeps you facing backward, replaying the specific instance, searching for the moment you could have chosen differently, as though enough analysis might retroactively change the outcome. Grief, done well, faces the loss directly, feels its actual weight, and then turns forward, carrying the knowledge of the cost rather than the compulsion to relitigate it. You are allowed the second. The first, however tempting, is just another way of staying inside the old pattern, dressed up as accountability. Consider what happens over the long term to someone who never itemizes this bill at all, who lives an entire life inside the vague, diffuse sense that something is off without ever converting that sense into anything specific enough to address. That person tends to arrive eventually at a particular kind of late-life reckoning. Not dramatic, usually quiet, often triggered by an ordinary event. A milestone birthday, the death of someone older. A conversation with a younger version of themselves in the form of someone else's 20-something child. The reckoning asks a simple, devastating question. Where did it go? Not the money. The years spent negotiating everything down before anyone else got the chance to say no. You are itemizing the bill now specifically so that question, when it eventually arrives, as it does for everyone, finds an answer already in progress rather than a lifetime of unexamined subtraction. The next chapter will explain why every previous attempt you've made to fix this failed. And it wasn't because you didn't try hard enough. It's because you were solving at the wrong layer entirely, using tools built for problems that were never your actual problem. Chapter 6. Why the Old Attempts Never Held. It was never a lack of effort you have tried before. This isn't your first attempt at change, and it's worth honoring that plainly before going further, because the story you've likely told yourself, quietly, is that you simply didn't try hard enough or didn't stick with it long enough or lacked the discipline that other people seem to have in greater supply. That story is not just unkind, it's inaccurate, and inaccurate diagnoses lead to the same failed prescription, repeated with slightly different packaging, year after year. Think back to the last time you attempted a real change. Maybe it was a new morning routine, or a boundary you tried to hold with a family member, or a financial goal you set with real conviction in January. You didn't approach it casually. You read something, felt something shift, and genuinely believed this time would be different. For a while it was. 2 weeks, maybe 6. And then, gradually, without a single dramatic moment of failure, you were back where you started, and you couldn't quite point to when the slide began. Here is what actually happened, and it has nothing to do with weak character. You changed the behavior at the loud level, the level of conscious decision, while leaving the accepted premise at the silent level completely untouched. You built a new habit on top of an old foundation, And the foundation, quietly, patiently, pulled the new structure back down to match its own shape. This isn't a metaphor for dramatic effect. It's a mechanical description of what happens whenever effort operates upstream of belief instead of the other way around. Consider the specific shape of past failures, because the shape is more informative than you'd expect. Notice how the slide back rarely happens during a crisis. It happens during a stretch of things going unusually well. You hold the new boundary successfully for 3 weeks. Feel a surge of pride and possibility. And then, in the middle of that surge, something pulls you back to the old pattern, often over something almost embarrassingly small. A comment from someone whose opinion shouldn't matter as much as it does. A single setback that, by itself, wouldn't derail someone who'd actually changed the premise underneath the behavior. This isn't coincidence. Success itself is the trigger, because success is exactly the condition your ceiling was built to correct. This explains something that has probably frustrated you for years without a clear name. The paradox of sabotaging yourself specifically at the moment things start working. You've likely interpreted this as some kind of internal enemy, a saboteur working against your stated interests. Return to the correction from a few chapters back, because it matters again here with more weight. There is no saboteur. There is a premise doing precisely what premises do, restoring the system to the range it has accepted as normal. The slide isn't malfunction. It's the mechanism working correctly, according to instructions you never consciously wrote, but have never revised either. Every self-help method you've tried before likely worked at one of 2 levels, and understanding which level explains exactly why it eventually stopped working for you. The first level is pure behavior modification. Trackers, habit stacks, accountability partners, external structures designed to make the new action easier to repeat. These tools are genuinely useful, and dismissing them entirely would be its own mistake. But they share a common limitation. They function like scaffolding around a building whose foundation was never actually repaired. Remove the scaffolding through a vacation, an illness, a hard month, and the building reverts to its original shape, because the shape was never really rebuilt. It was only temporarily supported. The second level is pure belief modification without behavioral follow-through. Affirmations repeated in isolation, visualization exercises practiced as a standalone ritual, positive thinking treated as a mental supplement rather than something requiring embodiment. This level fails for the opposite reason. A new premise, adopted only in thought, without a single corresponding action to prove it true to the rest of your system, remains theoretical. Your mind, the part of it responsible for accepting premises as settled fact, is not persuaded by sentences alone. It's persuaded by evidence, and evidence requires behavior, repeated, specific, and witnessed by the part of you that's been keeping score for years. Real change requires both levels moving together, in a specific sequence that almost nobody explains clearly. The premise has to shift first, even slightly, even provisionally, before the behavior can hold. And the behavior then has to supply the evidence that makes the shifted premise credible enough to stick. Skip the first step, and the behavior collapses under the weight of an unchanged foundation. Skip the second step, and the shifted premise remains a nice idea you had once, filed away with all the other nice ideas that never became true. This is why the last 10 attempts didn't fail, because you weren't disciplined enough. They failed because discipline was never the missing ingredient. You were extraordinarily disciplined for weeks at a time, applying real effort to a structure that required a different kind of intervention entirely, one that starts not with a new action, but with a specific, honest confrontation of the premise underneath the action. There's a distinction worth drawing between motivation and conviction, because the previous attempts almost certainly ran on the first and mistook it for the second. Motivation is a mood. It arrives sometimes powerfully, usually triggered by a specific event, a birthday, a breakup, a book that hit you at the right moment. and it burns hot and fast, capable of carrying you through an impressive first 2 weeks before it depletes. Because moods are not designed to be permanent fuel sources. Conviction is different. It doesn't arrive as a feeling at all. It's closer to a structural commitment that persists whether or not the mood cooperates on a given day. And it's built almost always not from inspiration but from repeated, unglamorous evidence, accumulated slowly, that the new way actually works better than the old one did. Consider the honest question this raises about the attempts you've already made. Were you ever actually working with conviction? Or were you riding a wave of motivation that you mistook for something sturdier, disappointed each time it inevitably receded, and interpreting the recession as personal failure rather than the entirely predictable behavior of a mood-based fuel source running out? Most people, looking back honestly, find the same pattern across every failed attempt. Real motivation, genuinely felt, entirely insufficient on its own, mistaken repeatedly for the deeper thing it was never designed to be. This is not a reason for despair. It's a reason for relief, because it means the previous failures were never a verdict on your capacity for change. They were simply evidence that you'd been using the wrong fuel, and wrong fuel can be replaced. There's a longer-term consequence to this confusion worth naming directly, because it explains a specific kind of exhaustion you may recognize. Each time motivation was mistaken for conviction and subsequently failed, something quiet was added to the pile of evidence you've been accumulating against yourself. A small deposit into the belief that you specifically lack whatever the successful people have: discipline, willpower, some inborn steadiness you were simply never issued. This belief compounds. It becomes its own premise, sitting on top of the original one, making the next attempt at change feel not just difficult, but almost foolish to undertake, given the track record. Separating motivation from conviction retroactively undoes a portion of that compounded belief, because it relocates the failure to the correct place. The fuel was wrong. You were never the evidence. Chapter 7. The First Real Movement. The fragment that still works. Even now, there's a specific kind of moment you've had before, brief and easy to dismiss, that actually contains everything this book has been building toward. It happens in the space between deciding something and doing it, a space so small most people never notice it exists. You feel the old pull, the familiar undertow toward the smaller option, the safer number, the quieter version of what you actually want. And then, for reasons you couldn't fully explain at the time, you didn't follow it. You asked for the number you actually needed. You stayed in the room. You said the true sentence instead of the polite one. That moment was not an accident, and it was not luck. It was the first visible evidence that the premise, however entrenched, is not permanent. It can be interrupted, and interruption, however small, is the actual mechanism of change, not the dramatic overhaul you've been waiting for. The total transformation that arrives in a single decisive weekend. Real change has almost never looked like that for anyone, despite what the books with dramatic titles tend to imply. Here is what makes this first movement so easy to underrate, and so easy to forget the moment it's over. It rarely feels triumphant while it's happening. It feels almost anticlimactic, a small, quiet choice made in an ordinary moment, with no music swelling underneath it. You asked for the raise, got it, and within an hour you were back to answering emails, the moment already fading into the texture of an unremarkable Tuesday. Your mind, trained for years to notice threat and register drama, has almost no built-in mechanism for flagging quiet victories as significant. This is precisely why so many people live an entire life full of small proofs that the premise is wrong, without ever accumulating them into anything they'd recognize as evidence. This is the actual work now, not creating a dramatic new moment, but noticing and collecting the ones that have already happened, and the ones that are about to. Think back, specifically, to a single instance where you did the braver thing instead of the smaller one, however minor it seems in retrospect. Maybe you set a boundary with a parent that you'd avoided setting for a decade. Maybe you simply let a compliment land without immediately deflecting it into self-deprecation. Whatever it was, however small, that instant was data. Your system logged it, whether you consciously noticed or not, as a piece of evidence that contradicts the accepted premise. The mistake most people make here is waiting for a moment large enough to feel like proof before they start counting it as such. This waiting is itself a symptom of the old premise operating, quietly raising the bar for what counts as real change so high that nothing ever clears it. Lower the bar deliberately. A single sentence said honestly instead of diplomatically is proof. A single number stated without apology is proof. You are not looking for a moment that rewrites your whole identity in one stroke. You are looking for a fragment, and then another fragment, until the fragments start to outnumber the old pattern enough that your system has to update its model of what's normal. There's a specific reason fragments work better than grand gestures, and it has to do with how believability actually functions in the part of your mind responsible for accepting premises as settled. A dramatic sudden change reads, to that part of you, as suspicious, almost fraudulent, precisely because it's so far outside the established pattern that it doesn't feel earned. But a small repeated fragment, quiet, consistent, unremarkable, slips past the part of you that guards against dramatic change, because it doesn't trigger the alarm. It looks too minor to matter, which is exactly why it works. You are not trying to convince a skeptical internal auditor with a single spectacular receipt. You are trying to file enough small receipts that the pattern becomes undeniable over time. Try this now, specifically, before moving to the next chapter. Identify one place in your life, right now, today, where the old pattern is about to run its usual script. Perhaps it's an email you're about to send with an apologetic softening you don't actually feel. Perhaps it's a conversation later today where you already know you'll shrink the true version of what you want to say into something smaller and safer. Whatever it is, don't try to overhaul the entire pattern in one motion. Just interrupt it once, in this one instance, and let the interruption be small enough that you can actually follow through on it. This is the part where authority without arrogance matters most. You are not being asked to believe immediately and completely that you are a different person now. That belief will come later, earned gradually, through repetition, not declared prematurely through willpower alone. What you're being asked to do is smaller, and in a strange way harder. Act once, in a single specific instance, as though the new premise were already true, without requiring yourself to feel convinced first. Feeling convinced comes after the evidence accumulates, not before. You've spent years waiting to feel ready before acting differently, and readiness, as you've defined it, has never actually arrived, because readiness was never really the prerequisite. It was the reward. The fragment is available to you right now, in whatever ordinary moment is coming next in your day. Small, quiet, unremarkable enough that no one else will notice it happened. There's a distinction worth making between a fragment and a fluke, because your mind will try, initially, to file the first as the second. A fluke is something that happened once, attributable to unusual circumstances, unlikely to repeat, and therefore safe to dismiss without revising anything. A fragment is the same event, refused that dismissal, held instead as a genuine data point about what's actually possible for you. The event itself doesn't determine which category it falls into. Your decision about how to interpret it does. This is worth naming plainly, because the old premise has a vested interest in every piece of contrary evidence being classified as a fluke, one at a time, indefinitely, which is precisely how a person can accumulate years of proof that they're capable of more and still, somehow, never update the underlying belief. Consider the long-term consequence of consistently choosing the fragment interpretation over the fluke interpretation, applied not just to today's small act of courage, but to everyone that follows it. Each fragment held as evidence rather than dismissed as an exception makes the next fragment slightly easier to notice, slightly harder to explain away, until eventually the accumulated weight of fragments becomes heavier than the old premise's capacity to dismiss them individually. This is not a fast process, and it was never going to be. But it is a reliable one, considerably more reliable than waiting for a single transformative event, dramatic enough to overturn years of accepted premise in one stroke. That event, statistically, almost never comes. The fragments, chosen deliberately and interpreted honestly, always do. There's an honest question worth asking yourself right now before the day's fragment has even arrived. What has been your habit specifically when small proof of your own capability has shown up in the past? Did you let it register briefly before moving on to the next task, or did you actively minimize it, deflecting the compliment, attributing the success to luck, timing, or the leniency of whoever was judging? Most people discover, looking honestly, that they've been quietly disqualifying their own evidence for years, running an internal court that only ever rules in favor of the original verdict. Today's fragment does not require you to feel triumphant about it. It only requires you to let it stand, uncontested, exactly as it happened, without the automatic disqualification that's kept the old premise so comfortably in place for so long. Chapter 8. What rises when you actually try? The internal resistance, named without romance. You interrupt the pattern once, the way the last chapter asked you to, and something happens that nobody warned you about clearly enough. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels, for a strange and unsettling stretch of time, like danger. Your chest tightens slightly after you send the honest email instead of the softened one. You feel a low current of dread after you hold the boundary instead of collapsing it. This is not a sign that you did something wrong. It's a sign that you did something real and real change at the moment it actually starts happening. Almost never feels like the relief you were promised in the brochure. Here is what's actually occurring, described plainly instead of dramatically. The premise you've operated from for years has functioned until now as a kind of safety mechanism, however costly. It kept you inside a range of behavior your system considered survivable. Stepping outside that range, even in a direction that's objectively good for you, registers to a part of your nervous system as unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory has always been coded biologically as risk. Growth and danger, at the level your body processes information, share the same physical signature. Faster heartbeat, tightened chest, a vague, wordless urge to retreat to where things were smaller and known. This is why the resistance tends to arrive at exactly the wrong moment, according to your conscious plans, and exactly the right moment, according to the old system's logic. It shows up right after you do the brave thing, not before. You'd expect fear to peak in anticipation, and then fade once you've acted, the way it does with something like public speaking. But this fear often does the opposite. It's quiet beforehand, almost absent, and then arrives afterward, once the new behavior is already real and can no longer be undone. This delayed arrival is not a coincidence. It's the system, having failed to prevent the action, now working to make sure it doesn't happen again. Name this resistance honestly, because vague dread is much harder to withstand than dread you can actually describe. It usually shows up as a specific, quiet accusation, spoken in a voice that sounds remarkably like your own. You're being reckless. You're going to regret this. This isn't who you actually are. That last one deserves particular attention, because it's the most convincing and the most wrong. The resistance will always frame the old pattern as your true identity, and the new behavior as some kind of performance or overreach. This framing has it exactly backward. The old pattern was never who you are. It was who you became, adapted to circumstances that, in most cases, no longer even apply. There's a useful distinction here between fear that's protecting you from actual danger and fear that's protecting an old, outdated model of danger. Real fear, the kind that keeps you from stepping into traffic, is fast, specific, and tied to an immediate physical threat. The resistance you're feeling after the honest email or the held boundary is neither fast nor specific in that way. It's diffuse, generalized, and oriented not toward physical safety, but toward psychological familiarity. It's not protecting your body. It's protecting the internal model of yourself that the old pattern was built to maintain. Confusing these two kinds of fear, treating the second as though it carries the same authority as the first, is one of the most common reasons people retreat the moment real change begins. This is also where the difference between disturbing your comfort and disturbing your safety becomes essential, because the resistance will always try to blur the two. Comfort is what you feel when nothing is being asked of you, when the pattern runs uninterrupted and familiar. Safety is a physical, factual condition, largely unrelated to how comfortable you feel in a given moment. You can be entirely safe and deeply uncomfortable at the same time, and learning to sit inside that specific combination, safe but uncomfortable, is close to the actual definition of what growth requires. The resistance will insist urgently that discomfort is evidence of danger. It rarely is. Usually it's only evidence that something old is being asked to loosen its grip. Here's what almost nobody tells you about this stage, and it matters more than any technique for managing the discomfort itself. The resistance is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's closer to a sign you're doing it correctly. If you interrupted the pattern and felt nothing at all, no discomfort, no internal pushback whatsoever, that would actually be the concerning outcome, because it would suggest the interruption was too small to register as a real deviation from the established premise. The discomfort you're feeling right now, reading this, thinking about the fragment you're about to attempt, is not a warning sign. It's confirmation that you're finally pressing against something real. The old pattern will not let go quietly, and expecting it to is part of what's made previous attempts fail. It negotiated for years for the position it currently holds, and it will not vacate that position simply because you've decided this week to try something different. What it will do, if you hold steady through the discomfort instead of retreating from it, is slowly, grudgingly, begin updating its model of what's actually dangerous and what isn't. This doesn't happen through a single act of bravery. It happens through repetition, through proving again and again that the discomfort you feared would destroy you was actually survivable the entire time. There's a distinction worth carrying forward from this chapter specifically, because it will save you from a mistake almost everyone makes at exactly this stage. The difference between resistance that's diminishing and resistance that's simply becoming familiar. The two can feel identical from the inside, since both produce a milder, more manageable version of the original discomfort. But they mean very different things about where you actually stand. Diminishing resistance means the underlying premise is genuinely loosening its grip. Familiarizing resistance means the premise is fully intact, and you've simply gotten used to the sensation of fighting it, the way a person can get used to a chronic ache without the ache itself having improved at all. The only reliable way to tell these apart is to test the boundary again, deliberately, in a slightly higher stakes version of the same situation, and notice whether the resistance scales down proportionally or reappears at full strength the moment the stakes increase. If it reappears in full force, that's not bad news. It's precise, useful information, telling you exactly where the actual edge of the current work still sits, so that you can meet it there instead of assuming, prematurely, that the entire structure has already been dismantled simply because its outermost layer has grown quiet. Notice finally the specific physical vocabulary this chapter has been building, because it will serve you well beyond this particular pattern. Tightness in the chest after an honest sentence, a wordless urge toward the smaller known version of a situation, a specific accusation that sounds like your own voice but argues for the old position. Learning to recognize these signals quickly as symptoms of growth rather than warnings of danger, is one of the more transferable skills this entire process offers. Every future stretch you attempt, in any domain of your life, will likely announce itself through this same vocabulary. You are not just addressing one pattern. You are learning to read a language your body has been speaking to you for years, largely in a dialect you'd never been taught to translate correctly until now. Chapter 9. When Nothing is on Your Side. Applying the shift when energy is low and the pattern wants back in everything so far has assumed a version of you with enough energy to notice the pattern, name it, and interrupt it deliberately. That version exists on your good days, and good days are not the problem. The real test arrives on a Tuesday when you've slept 4 hours. The inbox is already on fire before 9, and someone says something small and thoughtless that lands like an accusation. This is the moment the old pattern was actually built for, and it knows it. Notice something important about how the pattern operates under depletion, because it changes shape depending on your available resources. On a well-rested day, interrupting the pattern feels almost effortful, but doable, a conscious act you can choose because you have the bandwidth to choose it. Under exhaustion, stress, or emotional depletion, the pattern doesn't ask for your cooperation anymore. It simply runs, faster than the part of you that would normally catch it, and you find yourself 3 sentences into the smaller, safer, more familiar version of yourself before you've even registered a choice was available. This isn't a personal failing unique to you. It's how every trained pattern behaves under low resources, in every person, without exception. The pattern that requires the least energy always wins when energy itself is the scarce resource. This matters because it reframes what a relapse into the old behavior actually means. You will have days, weeks even, where the old pattern runs uninterrupted, where you shrink the request, avoid the honest sentence, retreat to the familiar smallness you've been working to leave behind. The temptation, in that moment, is to read the relapse as proof that nothing has actually changed, that the last 8 chapters were a temporary delusion, and the old identity was the true one all along. This reading is not just unkind, it's factually backward. A relapse under depletion tells you nothing about whether change is real. It only tells you that depletion, predictably, favors the path requiring the least energy, which will always be the oldest, most rehearsed path available. Here is the distinction that matters most in this chapter, and it's one that almost nobody draws clearly enough. The difference between a lapse and a return to baseline. A lapse is a single instance, contained, followed by a return to the new pattern once resources recover. A return to baseline is something else entirely. A sustained retreat where the lapse becomes the new normal, unexamined and unquestioned. The difference between these two outcomes has almost nothing to do with willpower, and almost everything to do with what you tell yourself in the hour immediately following the lapse. Consider 2 people who both had the exact same exhausted Tuesday. Both shrank the request they meant to make. Both watched the old pattern run without catching it in time. One of them treats the lapse as data confirming the old familiar story. I knew I hadn't really changed. This was never going to work for someone like me. The other treats it as exactly what it is. Evidence that depletion favors old patterns, nothing more, nothing less, with no verdict attached about identity or permanence. The first person is far more likely to slide into a full return to baseline, because the story they told themselves after the lapse did the pattern's work for it. The second person is far more likely to simply resume the new behavior once their resources recover, because they never handed the lapse more authority than it actually deserved. This is why the story you tell yourself immediately after a lapse matters more than the lapse itself. The old pattern doesn't just want to run once during a bad Tuesday. It wants you to interpret that single instance as proof of a permanent truth about who you are. because that interpretation is what actually keeps the pattern in charge long after the exhausted Tuesday has passed. Refuse the interpretation even while accepting the instance plainly and without excuse, and you deny the pattern the only thing it actually needs to maintain its position: your belief that the lapse revealed something true and unchangeable underneath. There's a practical implication here worth naming directly. On depleted days, don't expect yourself to perform the interruption with the same clarity you'd have on a rested day. Lower the bar specifically for these days, deliberately, in advance, rather than discovering the lowered capacity in the moment and mistaking it for failure. Perhaps on a good day the fragment looks like a fully honest conversation. On a depleted day, the fragment might simply be noticing, after the fact, that the old pattern ran, and naming it quietly to yourself without the self-punishment that used to follow. That noticing, small as it seems, is still a fragment. It still counts. There's a distinction worth naming here that changes how you'll plan for the depleted days going forward. The difference between preparing for a rested version of yourself and preparing for the actual person who's going to show up on a hard Tuesday. Most planning fails because it's done by the rested version, optimistic, clear-headed, generous in its assumptions about future capacity, and then handed off to a depleted version who cannot possibly execute a plan built for someone else's resources. This mismatch, not any deficiency in you, explains why so many well-intentioned systems collapse the first time real exhaustion arrives. Consider what it would mean to plan honestly instead, building explicitly for the depleted version of yourself rather than hoping she doesn't show up too often. This means designing the smallest possible version of the practice in advance, something so minimal it requires almost no resources to execute: a single sentence, a single noticing, a single moment of refusing the old interpretation of a lapse, and treating that minimal version as a full success on the days that call for it, rather than a disappointing fallback from some more ambitious version you failed to reach. The long-term consequence of this kind of honest planning is significant. It removes the recurring cycle of ambitious intention, followed by depleted failure, followed by self-criticism, replacing it with something far more sustainable, a floor low enough that almost no day, however hard, falls beneath it entirely. There's a distinction worth making finally between resilience and rigidity, because the two are often confused in exactly this context. Rigidity insists the practice look identical every single day, regardless of circumstance, and breaks the first time reality refuses to cooperate with that insistence. Resilience bends the shape of the practice to match the day's actual resources without ever fully abandoning it, showing up as a full version on good days and a minimal version on hard ones, and treating both as legitimate expressions of the same underlying commitment. You are not being asked to perform an identical ritual every day for the rest of your life. You're being asked to remain in relationship with the practice, in whatever form the day can actually hold, which is a considerably more sustainable and considerably more human way to build something that lasts. The version of you who shows up exhausted deserves a practice built for her, not a verdict about her worth. Chapter 10. The Other Person in the Room. How the pattern behaves in the presence of someone else. Everything up to this point has happened largely inside you, in the space between your own thoughts and your own behavior. But the pattern rarely stays that private for long, because most of your life happens in rooms with other people in them, and other people have a way of activating the pattern faster and more completely than solitude ever could. Notice something specific about how this works. Alone, you can sometimes hold the new premise for hours at a time, quiet and stable, undisturbed. Then a particular person walks into the room, or calls, or sends a single text, and within seconds you feel yourself contracting back into the smaller, older version of who you've been trying to leave behind. This isn't weakness. It's evidence of something important. The pattern was never built in isolation, and it doesn't operate in isolation either. It was built largely in relationship, which means relationship is where it activates most predictably and most powerfully. Consider the specific people in your life who seem to trigger the old pattern with unusual reliability. There's often one, maybe two, whose presence alone is enough to undo weeks of careful, deliberate change. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't about that person being uniquely difficult, although they may genuinely be difficult. It's because your nervous system learned the original premise, in most cases, inside a specific relationship, often early, often with someone who held real power over your safety and belonging. That original relationship taught your system what was required to stay safe, loved, or simply tolerated. And now, any relationship that carries even a faint echo of that original dynamic can reactivate the entire premise almost instantly, faster than conscious thought can intervene. This explains something you've probably noticed, but never quite named: how you can be one version of yourself with certain people, and a completely different version with others, sometimes within the same afternoon. You are not being fake in either version. Both are real expressions of you, shaped by which premise gets activated by which relationship. The version of you that emerges around a parent who has always found you difficult to please is not a performance. It's the original pattern, still fully intact, waiting exactly where it was built, activated the moment the right context appears. Here's the distinction that matters most in this chapter, and it reframes how you'll think about the people around you going forward. There is a difference between a relationship that requires the old pattern and a relationship that simply happens to trigger it out of habit. The first kind genuinely cannot tolerate the new, expanded version of you and will resist it actively, sometimes without even realizing they're doing so. The second kind would likely welcome the new version, given time, but the old habitual dynamic between you is so deeply grooved that both of you default to it automatically, the way you'd default to a native language even after years of fluency in a second one. Distinguishing between these two is essential, because the correct response to each is almost opposite. A relationship that actively requires your smallness to function, that grows tense or punishing the moment you hold a boundary or ask for more, is telling you something honest about its actual terms, and no amount of your personal growth will change those terms unilaterally. A relationship that simply defaults to the old groove out of habit, without actual resistance to your growth once it's clearly and consistently demonstrated, is a different situation entirely, one that can genuinely evolve as you hold the new pattern steadily enough for long enough that the old groove stops being the automatic default. There's a specific kind of grief that arrives here, and it deserves to be named rather than rushed past. As you hold the new premise more consistently, some relationships will simply not survive the change, not because you did anything wrong, but because the relationship's actual foundation depended on your smallness, in a way neither of you had ever consciously acknowledged. This loss is real, and it's appropriate to feel it fully rather than treating it as an acceptable casualty of growth to be dismissed quickly. You are allowed to grieve a relationship that couldn't hold the more expanded version of you, even while recognizing that its ending was, in the end, necessary. At the same time, notice the relationships that surprise you, the ones you assumed would resist your change and instead, given a little time and consistency, adapted alongside you. These relationships are worth paying close attention to, because they're teaching you something the old pattern never let you see clearly: that some of the people you've been protecting from the real expanded version of yourself never actually needed that protection in the first place. You built the smallness partly out of genuine necessity once, with someone specific. You've been generalizing that necessity to nearly everyone since, without ever testing whether it was still required. There's a distinction worth holding carefully here between accommodation and erasure, because the relational work in this chapter can easily be misread as a demand that every relationship bend entirely to your growth or be discarded. That reading is too simple, and it costs people relationships that could have evolved with a little more patience than they were given. Accommodation means a relationship adjusting its terms to make room for more of your actual self, without either party disappearing in the process. Erasure means one person's expansion requiring the complete dissolution of the other person's role, which is rarely what genuine growth actually demands, however much the early, urgent phase of change might feel that way. Consider the long-term consequence of failing to make this distinction. Treat every relational friction as proof that a relationship requires your smallness, and you risk dismantling connections that would have adapted, given time and a little grace extended in both directions. Treat every relational friction as simply a habit to push through, and you risk staying in dynamics that genuinely cannot, and will not, accommodate the person you're becoming, no matter how much time you give them. The honest work here is slower and less satisfying than either extreme. It requires watching, specifically and patiently, which relationships move with you when given the chance, and which ones reveal, through repeated and consistent resistance, that the smallness was never incidental to begin with. There's an honest question worth asking about your own patterns of company, since you've likely never mapped it explicitly before. Which relationships in your life currently require the old version of you to remain stable? And which ones have quietly been waiting this entire time for you to bring more of yourself into the room? You may find the answer surprising in both directions. Some relationships you assumed were solid, foundational, unshakable, may reveal a surprising fragility the moment you stop shrinking inside them. And some relationships you assumed were shallow, casual, and incapable of holding anything real, may turn out to have far more room in them than you ever tested, simply because you never brought enough of yourself into the room to find out. Mapping this honestly, once, is worth more than years of vague intuition about who's safe and who isn't. Chapter 11. Where it actually comes from. The oldest root, and why it survived this long. You've been circling this question since the first page, holding it at arm's length deliberately, because naming the origin too early would have given you somewhere to place blame instead of somewhere to place attention. Now that you've named the pattern, itemized its cost, and watched it operate in your closest relationships, you're ready to look at where it actually began, without turning that origin into either an excuse or an indictment of anyone involved. Go back further than you'd normally allow yourself to go. Not to the last argument, not to the last disappointing year, but to somewhere early, somewhere small, a room you might not have thought about in a long time. Most people, when they finally do this honestly, find something surprisingly modest at the root. Not always trauma in the dramatic sense the word has come to imply. Sometimes it's a single repeated moment. A parent's face falling almost imperceptibly when you expressed a want too directly. A sibling who got more attention for being easier to manage than you were. A specific afternoon when wanting something openly resulted in a consequence severe enough that some quiet, efficient part of you decided, then and there, that wanting openly wasn't safe. Here's what matters about this kind of origin, and it's the part that most explanations skip entirely. The premise wasn't installed because anyone involved was cruel or intended harm. In the vast majority of cases, it was installed by ordinary people, doing their imperfect best, in circumstances you likely didn't have full visibility into as a child. A parent exhausted by their own unresolved scarcity taught you without meaning to that wanting too much was dangerous. A caregiver stretched too thin to notice your particular need taught you that needs beyond the basic ones weren't worth voicing. None of this requires villains. It only requires ordinary human limitation, transmitted quietly across a relationship where you had far less power than the adults around you. This distinction matters enormously, because the instinct at this stage often runs in one of two unhelpful directions. Either you assign blame so completely that the origin becomes a permanent grievance, something you carry as evidence against a person rather than information about a pattern, or you excuse the origin so thoroughly that you talk yourself out of examining it at all, insisting it wasn't really that significant, that other people had it worse, that you're being dramatic even considering it. Both directions protect you from the same uncomfortable middle ground. The origin was real, it did shape you, and no one involved necessarily meant for it to. Consider why the premise survived so long after the original circumstances stopped applying. This is the part that genuinely surprises people once they see it clearly. The premise wasn't designed to be temporary. It was designed by the part of you responsible for keeping you safe, to be permanent. Because at the moment it was installed, permanence looked like the safer bet. A child who concludes that wanting is dangerous doesn't build a premise with an expiration date. They build one meant to last, because the part of the mind doing the building doesn't yet have the capacity to imagine a future where the original threat no longer applies. This is why you can be 35, financially secure, surrounded by people who would never punish you for wanting something openly, and still operate from a premise built for an entirely different set of circumstances, decades old, no longer relevant to a single fact of your actual current life. The premise doesn't update automatically just because the world around it changed. It requires something deliberate, a conscious recognition that the conditions which justified it are no longer the conditions you're actually living in. Here's a distinction worth holding carefully as you sit with your own origin. There's a difference between honoring what the pattern once did for you and continuing to need it now. The premise, whatever shape it took, likely did protect you once genuinely, in circumstances where the alternative might have been worse. A child who learns to want less in a household with limited resources or limited emotional bandwidth is adapting sensibly to real conditions. That adaptation deserves acknowledgement, even gratitude, rather than contempt. The problem was never the original adaptation. The problem is only that it never received the update it needed once the circumstances that required it were no longer the circumstances you live in. You can hold both of these at once, and holding both is actually the mature resolution here, more useful than either blame or dismissal. The pattern made sense once. It doesn't make sense now. Neither fact cancels the other out. The child who built this premise was doing something intelligent with limited information, and the adult reading this sentence is allowed to update the premise without that update becoming a betrayal of the child who needed it first. There's a distinction worth carrying out of this chapter and into everything that follows: the difference between explaining and excusing. Understanding where the premise came from explains its persistence. It doesn't excuse continuing to let it run your adult life unexamined, and confusing these two purposes is one of the more common ways people get stuck at exactly this stage of the work, treating a clear-eyed diagnosis of origin as though it were itself the cure. The origin story matters because it removes shame from the equation, not because naming it magically dissolves the pattern's grip going forward. The dissolving still requires everything the earlier chapters described: the fragments, the resistance held steady, the structure built to protect the gains. Consider the honest question this raises, one worth sitting with before moving forward. Now that you know where it came from, and now that you've released the impulse to blame anyone for its installation, what actually changes about your relationship to the premise today? The answer, if you're honest, it is less dramatic than you might expect, and more useful for exactly that reason. Nothing about the daily practice changes. The fragments still need collecting. The resistance still needs holding. What changes is the tone underneath the practice, a shift from fighting something shameful to revising something outdated. And that shift in tone, subtle as it sounds, tends to make the entire remaining process considerably easier to sustain. There's a longer consequence worth naming here, one that extends well past your own life if you happen to be raising, mentoring, or simply influencing anyone younger than you. Premises transmit. The exhausted parent at the kitchen table, the caregiver too stretched to notice a particular need, passed something along without ever intending to, the same way you are passing something along right now, in ways you cannot fully see, to whoever is watching how you handle your own wanting. Understanding the origin of your own premise isn't only an act of self-repair. Done honestly, It's also the clearest way to interrupt a transmission before it reaches whoever comes next. An inheritance you get to decide, for the first time, whether to keep passing forward unexamined. Choosing differently here, deliberately, is quiet work, but it is some of the most consequential work available to anyone paying close attention. Chapter 12. Why the Progress Disappears. What happens without structure, and how to protect what you've gained. Something predictable happens about 6 weeks into real change, and almost nobody warns you about it clearly enough for it to help when it arrives. The initial momentum, the energy that came from finally naming the pattern and interrupting it a few times, starts to fade. Not because the change failed, because the novelty that carried you through the first weeks was never designed to carry you indefinitely. And mistaking novelty for permanent transformation is one of the quietest ways progress gets lost. Consider what actually happened during those first energetic weeks. Naming the pattern for the first time produced a kind of clarity that felt, understandably, like the hard part was over. You could see the mechanism clearly. You'd interrupted it a few times successfully, and the sheer relief of finally understanding something that had confused you for years generated its own temporary fuel. That fuel is real, and it's useful, but it's also finite, tied to the novelty of insight rather than to anything durable. Once the insight stops feeling new, once naming the pattern becomes familiar rather than revelatory, the fuel it provided runs out, and if nothing has replaced it, the old pattern doesn't need to fight its way back. It simply resumes, because nothing structural was ever built to keep it from resuming. This is the distinction that separates people who sustain real change from people who experience a temporary uptick followed by a slow return to the exact starting point. Insight on its own changes nothing permanently. It only creates a window, brief and valuable, during which actual structural change becomes possible. Walk through that window while it's open, and the change has a chance to become durable. Wait for the insight itself to keep doing the work indefinitely, and you'll find yourself, months later, confused about why you're back where you started, despite having understood the mechanism so clearly at one point. Here's what structural change actually requires, stated plainly rather than mystically. It requires the new behavior to become attached to something more reliable than motivation. Because motivation, tied as it is to novelty and energy, was never built to last. The people who successfully shift a premise long-term almost always attach the new behavior to a specific trigger, a specific moment, a specific structure that doesn't depend on remembering to feel motivated on a given day. Not a vague intention to be more honest going forward. A specific practice, naming the fragment out loud each night before sleep, regardless of how the day went. Not a general commitment to ask for more. A specific number decided in advance below which you no longer negotiate. Notice the difference between a wish and a structure. A wish lives entirely in the loud level of conscious intention, dependent on remembering, on having the energy that day to enact it. A structure lives partly outside of you, in a specific time, place, or trigger, that doesn't require you to generate the motivation fresh each time. This is why nearly every sustainable change in human behavior, across every domain, from health to finance to relationships, eventually gets anchored to something structural rather than remaining purely a matter of willpower. Willpower is a real resource, but it's a depleting one, and depending on it exclusively is choosing the least reliable tool available for a job that requires reliability above all else. Consider, specifically, what structure would actually protect the progress you've made through this book. Not a vague resolution to keep being different. Something you can point to, specific enough to survive a bad week without evaporating. Perhaps it's a single sentence you review each morning, not as an affirmation to be believed instantly, but as a reminder of the premise you're actively revising. Perhaps it's a specific person, told explicitly what you're working on, who can reflect back to you when the old pattern is running, since you've already learned how invisible the pattern can be to the person caught inside it. There's a particular danger at this exact stage worth naming directly, because it catches people off guard specifically when they feel furthest along. The moment progress starts to feel automatic, unremarkable, no longer requiring conscious attention, is precisely the moment it's most vulnerable to disappearing, because automatic and unremarkable can mean either that the new premise has genuinely stabilized or that the old vigilance protecting it has simply relaxed. These two states feel identical from the inside, and the only way to tell them apart is time, and the only way to survive the ambiguity is structure sturdy enough to hold regardless of which state you're actually in. There's a distinction worth sitting with before you close this chapter. The difference between a structure that supports you and a structure that punishes you for missing it. Some people, hearing that structure matters more than motivation, overcorrect into rigid systems, elaborate trackers, punitive consequences for a skipped day, treating any lapse in the structure as a fresh failure requiring its own repair. This overcorrection tends to fail faster than no structure at all, because it recreates the exact dynamic the earlier chapters warned against: harsh judgment following a lapse, which reinforces the old premise more reliably than the lapse itself ever could. Consider what a genuinely supportive structure looks like instead, one built with the same compassion you'd extend to someone else attempting this work. It has a low floor, forgiving of the depleted days described a few chapters back. It has a clear trigger, specific enough not to depend on remembering. And critically, it has a built-in mechanism for treating a missed day as data rather than disaster. A simple return to the practice the next day, without an elaborate penance in between. The long-term consequence of choosing this kind of structure over a punitive one is significant. Punitive structures tend to get abandoned entirely the first time they're broken, since breaking them once already feels like failure, while forgiving structures survive exactly the kind of ordinary, human inconsistency that any structure sustained over years is going to encounter. There's an honest question worth asking about your own history with structure, since the answer usually explains a great deal about why past systems failed. Have the structures you've built for yourself in the past tended to resemble a demanding supervisor, tracking every deviation, or a steady companion, simply present, undemanding, there again tomorrow regardless of today's outcome? Most people, examining their history honestly, find they've spent years building supervisors and wondering why they eventually quit on all of them. A companion asks far less of you in the moment, and precisely because it asks less, it tends to still be there years later, quietly doing the work a more demanding structure never survived long enough to do at all. Build the companion. You will need it longer than you expect, and it will ask less of you than you fear. The supervisor was never going to survive a decade. The companion just might. Choose the one you can actually still be showing up to in 5 years, not the one that looks most impressive on the first Monday. 5 quiet years of a companion beat 5 dramatic weeks of a supervisor, every single time. Chapter 13. Who You're Becoming, One Choice at a Time. The mechanism of identity, quietly rewriting itself. Somewhere around this point, without any single dramatic moment marking the shift, something starts to change in how you experience the new behavior. What began as effortful, a fragment you had to consciously choose against real internal resistance, starts to feel less like a decision and more like simply who you are. This transition, subtle and easy to miss, is actually the entire point of everything you've done so far, and it deserves to be understood clearly, rather than experienced as a vague, pleasant surprise you can't quite explain. Here is the distinction that matters most in this chapter, and it's one you've been building toward without necessarily having the words for it yet. There is a difference between doing something and being someone. Doing something requires a decision each time, a fresh act of will, energy spent deliberately against whatever resistance still exists. Being someone requires none of that. It simply happens, The way you don't decide each morning to be a person who brushes their teeth. You just are that person now, and the behavior follows automatically, without negotiation. Every fragment you've collected since Chapter 7, each one small and individually forgettable, has been quietly accumulating toward exactly this shift. You didn't notice it happening in real time, because identity shifts rarely announce themselves with a specific before and after moment you can point to later. They accumulate the way sediment becomes stone, through repetition compressed over enough time that the change becomes structural rather than temporary. One honest sentence didn't change who you are. 200 of them, said consistently enough, eventually did. Consider what's actually happening at the mechanical level during this transition, because understanding it will help you trust it rather than second-guessing it the moment it starts to feel real. Your mind, the part responsible for accepting premises as settled fact, doesn't update instantly based on a single dramatic proof. It updates gradually, based on accumulated evidence, the same way a jury doesn't convict on a single fact, but on a pattern of facts weighed together over time. Every fragment you've collected has functioned as a piece of evidence, submitted quietly to that internal jury, and at some point, evidence accumulates past the threshold required for a verdict to change. You don't feel the verdict changing in the moment. You only notice afterward that the old defendant, the old premise, no longer holds the position it once held. This is why identity change, done this way, feels earned rather than performed. You are not pretending to be someone more expansive, more deserving, more willing to want things openly. You have actually accumulated the specific evidence required to justify that identity, fragment by fragment, in a way that feels different from simply declaring a new identity and hoping the behavior catches up. Declared identity, unsupported by evidence, tends to feel hollow, slightly fraudulent, because some part of you knows the internal jury hasn't actually reached that verdict yet. Earned identity, built through accumulated fragments, feels solid precisely because it is. Notice something important about how this new identity behaves once it's genuinely established, because it changes your relationship to future resistance entirely. Early on, holding a boundary or asking for more required real conscious effort against real internal resistance. As the identity stabilizes, that same action starts to require almost no effort at all, not because the situation itself became easier, but because you're no longer fighting an internal premise that disagrees with the action. The fight was never really with the external circumstance. It was always with the internal premise, and once the premise updates, the external circumstance that used to require so much effort simply stops requiring it. This is also where you'll notice something quietly remarkable. The specific things that used to require the most willpower now require almost none, while other things you never thought about as difficult might suddenly reveal themselves as the next layer of the same pattern, operating at a level you weren't ready to see until this one resolved. This isn't a sign of failure or of going backward. Identity work happens in layers, and resolving one layer often reveals the next one underneath, previously hidden by the sheer size of the layer you've just finished addressing. Sit for a moment with a specific fragment from your own recent experience where the old resistance simply wasn't there anymore, where you did the once difficult thing without the internal struggle you would have expected months ago. That absence of struggle is not evidence that the thing was never actually hard. It's evidence that the identity underneath it has genuinely changed, that the internal jury has reached its verdict, quietly, without fanfare, exactly the way real change tends to arrive. There's a distinction worth naming here between identity and performance, since from a distance the two can look almost identical. Performance requires an audience, or at least the anticipation of one, and tends to falter the moment no one is watching, revealing itself as effortful precisely because it was never internalized past the surface. Identity requires nothing of the kind. It persists in the empty room exactly as it does in the crowded one, because it was never built for anyone else's confirmation in the first place. This is a useful test to apply to your own progress at this stage. Notice whether the new behavior holds steady in complete privacy, where no one would ever know if you reverted, or whether it only appears reliably when someone might be watching. Consider the long-term consequence of this distinction for how you'll experience the coming months. A performance requires constant maintenance, fresh energy each time an audience appears, and collapses quickly under fatigue or isolation. An identity, once genuinely established through the accumulated fragments described earlier, requires almost no maintenance at all, because it's no longer something you're doing for anyone's benefit, including your own. It's simply who you've become, in the specific, unglamorous way identity always actually forms. Not through declaration, but through enough repetition, in enough rooms, both public and private, that the internal jury finally closes the case. There's a final honest question worth sitting with here, one that will keep proving useful long after this particular chapter ends. When you picture the person you're becoming through this work, are you picturing someone impressive, admired, visibly transformed in ways others would notice and comment on? Or are you picturing someone simply steadier, quieter, less negotiable about her own worth, whether or not anyone else ever registers the difference? The honest answer matters because identity built for an audience remains fragile precisely where audiences are absent, while identity built for its own sake, regardless of who's watching, turns out to be the only kind that survives long enough to still be standing on the ordinary Tuesdays nobody else will ever know to celebrate. Build for the empty room, and the crowded one will take care of itself. That is the only audience whose verdict was ever actually worth earning, and it was in the room with you the entire time, waiting only for you to stop performing for it and start simply living as though it had already rendered its verdict. Chapter 14. Quiet, solid, yours. Permanence, without needing anyone to confirm it. There's a specific kind of moment that arrives eventually that looks almost disappointingly ordinary from the outside. You're offered something, a project, an opportunity, a relationship possibility, that would have once triggered the entire old sequence, the flinch, the internal negotiation downward, the smaller version accepted out of habit. This time, none of that happens. You simply consider the offer on its actual merits, decide what you actually want, and respond accordingly. No internal drama, no visible struggle, just a decision, made cleanly, the way you'd expect any reasonably functioning person to make it. The strange part is how anticlimactic this feels the first several times it happens. You might even wait for the old resistance to show up late, the way it sometimes did during earlier chapters, arriving hours afterward as delayed dread. When it doesn't come, there's almost a temptation to distrust the calm, to assume you're missing something because you've spent so long associating this particular kind of decision with internal conflict that its absence feels unfamiliar in its own right. This is worth naming clearly. The absence of struggle is not evidence that nothing changed. It's the clearest evidence available that something changed completely. This is the specific texture of permanence, and it rarely matches the version people imagine in advance. Most people picturing what lasting change would feel like imagine something closer to constant confidence, a persistent, visible certainty radiating outward. Actual permanence is quieter than that, and far less performative. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require you to announce it, to yourself or anyone else, because it no longer depends on external confirmation to feel real. The old pattern needed validation constantly, needed reassurance, comparison, proof gathered from outside sources that the smaller version of you was acceptable. The new pattern needs none of that. It simply operates privately, without requiring anyone's witness to remain true. Consider what this shift actually means for your relationship to other people's opinions, because it's one of the more significant and least discussed consequences of the work you've done. Early in this process, Other people's reactions to your changing behavior mattered enormously, sometimes almost unbearably. A skeptical look from someone when you held a new boundary could undo an entire week of progress. Now, at this stage, those same reactions register, but they no longer carry the same authority over your internal state. You notice the skepticism. You simply don't need it resolved in your favor anymore, because the verdict that matters was never really theirs to render. It was always yours, reached internally, through the accumulated evidence you've built over the previous chapters. This is the actual difference between confidence and this quieter thing that's replaced the old pattern. Confidence, as most people describe it, still depends on an internal comparison, a favorable verdict reached against some standard, external or internal. What you've built is closer to something else, less discussed and more durable, a simple absence of the old question. You are no longer asking each time an opportunity or a boundary or a want presents itself, whether you're allowed to have it. The question itself has quietly stopped being relevant, not because you answered it definitively in your favor, but because the entire framework that generated the question no longer applies to how you operate. There's a specific test worth applying here, gently, to check whether this permanence is genuinely yours or whether it's still in some subtle way borrowed and therefore fragile. Notice how you feel in a room with the specific person, mentioned back in Chapter 10, who used to reliably trigger the old pattern with unusual precision. If the new premise holds steady even there, in the presence of the person most likely to activate the old system, that's meaningful evidence of real stability. If it still wavers specifically in that one room, that's not failure. It's simply information about where the remaining work lives, and it's worth returning to that specific relationship with the tools you've built here, rather than assuming the entire structure has failed because one particular room still activates the old pattern. This permanence doesn't announce itself with fireworks, and it doesn't need to. It shows up as a Tuesday like any other, where you make a decision that would have once cost you days of internal negotiation, and it cost you nothing at all, and you don't even think to mention it to anyone because it no longer feels remarkable enough to require mentioning. That's not a smaller version of transformation. It's the only version that actually lasts, precisely because it stopped needing anyone, including you, to keep confirming that it's real. There's a distinction worth carrying forward from this chapter into the rest of your life, because it will keep mattering long after this particular book ends. The difference between permanence and immunity. Permanence means the premise has genuinely shifted and no longer runs your default behavior. It does not mean you've become immune to ever encountering the old pattern again, in a new form, in a new domain of your life the earlier chapters didn't happen to cover. New circumstances will occasionally locate an old, unexamined corner, and something in you will flinch in the familiar way, smaller, quieter, safer. This is not evidence that the work described in this book failed. It's evidence that identity work happens in layers, exactly as an earlier chapter described, and that finding a new layer is simply what happens when you've finished addressing an old one. Consider what it means practically to hold both permanence and this ongoing possibility at once, without letting the second undermine your trust in the first. The tools haven't changed. Notice the pattern. Name the premise beneath it honestly. Collect the small fragments of contrary evidence. Hold steady through the resistance that follows. What has changed is your relationship to the process itself. You are no longer discovering for the first time that such a mechanism exists inside you. You already know. And knowing this time means you can meet the next layer with considerably less alarm and considerably more speed than the first one required, because you've already proven, in the specific and irreversible way experience proves things, that the mechanism can be met and revised. Whatever layer comes next will ask less of you than this one did, precisely because you are no longer meeting it as a stranger. Recognition, it turns out, was the missing ingredient in every earlier attempt. Now you have it, and you keep it, whatever comes next. There's a final distinction worth carrying with you, one that separates people who keep this work alive for decades from people who let it fade back into the noise of ordinary life after a few good months. It's the difference between treating this book as a single intervention, completed and filed away, and treating it as the introduction to a permanent skill, one you'll keep applying quietly to whatever new corner of your life eventually reveals itself as still operating on an old, unexamined premise. The first approach produces a good year. The second produces an entirely different relationship to your own mind for the rest of your life. And it's the second one this book has actually been building toward from its very first page. Chapter 15. The Answer You Already Knew. Where the open loop finally closes, go back for a moment to the question that opened all of this. Not the version you'd have stated consciously, but the one underneath it. The one that kept you up at 2 a.m. checking a number that wasn't going to change simply because you looked at it again. The question was never what you do with your time. It was what you do with what's left of you after the time runs out. You didn't understand that sentence the first time you heard it. You understand it now. For years you measured your life by output. Hours logged, tasks completed, promotions earned, numbers that moved in the right direction on a spreadsheet somewhere. And underneath all of it, quietly, a second ledger was running. One nobody taught you to read. Not what you produced, but what remained of you once the producing stopped. That second ledger was always the real one. The first was only ever its shadow. Here is what you now understand about the mind that the earlier chapters were building toward, one fragment at a time. The mind is not a passive recorder of your circumstances. It is the actual mechanism generating them, continuously, according to whatever premise it has quietly accepted as settled. You spent years trying to change your circumstances directly, adjusting the visible layer, the effort, the strategy, the hustle, while the deeper layer, the one actually authoring the results, went untouched. This was never a failure of ambition. It was a failure of aim. You were always working on the transcript. The mind was always the author. This is not a metaphor, and it was never meant to comfort you in some abstract spiritual sense divorced from your actual life. It is a mechanical description of exactly what has been happening in every chapter of this book. The ceiling you found in Chapter 3 was never imposed on you from outside. It was a premise you built and then forgot you'd built it. The resistance in Chapter 8 was never evidence you were doing something wrong. It was evidence the old premise was finally being asked to move. The relapses in Chapter 9 were never proof that nothing had changed. They were proof of exactly how premises behave under depletion, in every person, without exception. Nothing in this book asked you to believe something conveniently. It asked you to look directly at a mechanism you'd spent a lifetime looking past. And now, having looked, you understand something that cannot be unseen. The creative power was never out there, waiting to be extracted through more effort. It was always here, running continuously, faithfully producing whatever you had quietly accepted as true. This is not a smaller discovery than the one you were hoping for when you first pressed play. It is a larger one. You were not missing a technique. You were misunderstanding your own authorship the entire time. Think back to the email at 6:47 in the morning, the promotion that didn't land the way it was supposed to. You understand now why it didn't. It was never a referendum on whether you deserved good news. It was a mirror, showing you, with total accuracy, exactly what you'd accepted as possible up to that point. The mirror was never cruel. It was only honest, reflecting back a premise you'd never examined closely enough to revise. You have examined it now, and the mirror has already started reflecting something different, quietly in the ordinary Tuesdays that no longer require the internal negotiation they used to require, in the rooms that used to activate the old pattern, and increasingly don't, in the number you ask for without rehearsing a smaller one first. Here is the sentence this entire narrative was built around. the one that finally answers the open loop planted at the very beginning. What you do with your time was never the real measure of a life. What matters is who is left standing at the end of the doing, and whether that person was built on a premise wide enough to hold what they actually wanted, or narrow enough to keep asking permission for it. You spent years optimizing the first question. You are only now answering the second. This is not the end of the work. Premises, once revised, still require tending, the way anything living requires tending. But you are no longer walking past the door pretending it's part of the wall. You know the room is there. You've been inside it. And the person who walked out of it is not waiting for a feeling to arrive anymore. Consider, one final time, the distinction that has been running underneath every chapter of this book, stated now in its complete form. The difference between a life lived as evidence and a life lived as inquiry. For years you lived as evidence, each outcome another data point confirming a premise you never chose to examine. The smallness of the results feeling less like a decision and more like an accurate report on who you actually were. That version of living asks nothing of you except continuation. It is comfortable in the specific way familiar things are comfortable, and it is exactly this comfort that keeps so many people inside it for an entire lifetime, mistaking the absence of friction for the presence of peace. A life lived as inquiry is different, and considerably more demanding, because it requires exactly what this book has been asking of you from the first page. A willingness to keep looking, past the point where looking felt necessary, at the mechanism generating your results, rather than only at the results themselves. This is not a destination you arrive at, and then stop needing. It is closer to a permanent orientation, the ongoing decision to treat every outcome as information about a premise, rather than as a verdict about your worth. You have spent 15 chapters learning to make this shift in one specific area of your life. The orientation itself, once genuinely adopted, extends to every area you'll ever choose to point it toward. Picture, one last time, the 2 o'clock room where all of this began. The phone opening and closing in the dark. The cold coffee across the table. That room still exists somewhere in your history. Unchangeable, exactly as it happened. But it no longer defines the room you're standing in now, because the person checking that number and the person reading this sentence are no longer operating from the same premise. And a premise, once genuinely revised, does not require the original room to be erased in order for its grip to end. The room stays in the past, precisely where it belongs. You are the one who moved, and the mind that moved you is the same one you'll keep authoring with, in every room still ahead. That is the whole of it, and it was always enough. Not more effort, not a better system. Only this, the mind, finally seen, finally trusted to author something worth keeping. The feeling was never missing. You were simply the first to arrive early, before you'd given yourself permission to notice it was already here.